October 25th, 1983, 5:36 a.m. In 8 seconds of sustained fire, a U.S. Navy destroyer would silence a coastal defense position that threatened an entire invasion force. 8 seconds. That's how long it took to announce that the world's most powerful military had arrived on the shores of a Caribbean island most Americans couldn't find on a map. This is the story of Operation Urgent Fury, a lightning strike that began in chaos, unfolded in darkness, and ended with questions that still haunt military strategists today. What happens when an invasion goes wrong from the first minute? When Navy SEALs drown before reaching shore? When friendly fire kills more Americans than the enemy? Welcome to the Grenada invasion. The 8-second showdown that almost became America's Caribbean disaster. To understand why American forces stormed a tropical island in 1983, you need to rewind 4 years earlier. Grenada, a speck in the Caribbean, 133 square miles. Population, 90,000. Known for nutmeg, not nukes. But in 1979, a Marxist revolutionary named Maurice Bishop seized power in a bloodless coup. He called it the People's Revolutionary Government. Washington called it a problem. Bishop cozied up to Cuba. Fidel Castro sent advisors, doctors, teachers, and something else. Construction workers. Hundreds of them. All with military training. They were building an airport. On paper, tourism infrastructure. In reality, a 9,000-foot runway capable of handling Soviet military aircraft. A strategic foothold 1,500 miles from Miami. The Reagan administration watched nervously. Every communist foothold in the Western Hemisphere was a breach of the Monroe Doctrine. Every Cuban advisor was a Soviet proxy. The Cold War wasn't just in Europe and Asia anymore. It was in America's backyard. Then, in October 1983, the situation exploded. Bernard Cord, Bishop's deputy and a hardline Marxist, staged a coup within the coup. Bishop was placed under house arrest. Protests erupted. On October 19th, Bishop's supporters freed him and marched to Fort Rupert, the Army headquarters. The military opened fire. Maurice Bishop and 7 of his cabinet members were executed against a wall. General Hudson Austin seized control. A shoot-on-sight curfew was imposed. The island descended into chaos. And on that island were 600 American citizens, most of them medical students at St. George's University. President Ronald Reagan was in Augusta, Georgia, playing golf when the news broke. Within hours, he convened the National Security Council. The question wasn't if America would act, it was how fast. Reagan faced a perfect storm of justification. 1. American lives at risk. The hostage crisis in Iran was still fresh in the national memory. No president wanted another televised humiliation. 2. A formal request for intervention from the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. 6 neighboring islands feared Grenadian instability would spread. 3. Cold War optics. If America couldn't protect its own citizens 1,500 miles from home, what message did that send to Moscow? The decision was made. Operation Urgent Fury would launch in 48 hours. Joint Chiefs scrambled to assemble an invasion force from units scattered across the Atlantic. Navy SEALs from Virginia, Army Rangers from Georgia, Marines from North Carolina, paratroopers from Fort Bragg. The problem? Almost no solid intelligence. Maps of Grenada were outdated. Satellite imagery was limited. The CIA had minimal assets on the ground. Commanders were forced to use tourist maps purchased from gas stations. One special operations officer later admitted they knew more about Soviet military bases in Siberia than they did about this tiny Caribbean island. But the clock was ticking. October 24th. Midnight. The first Americans into Grenada wouldn't arrive by ship or helicopter. They would fall from the sky into a black ocean. SEAL Team 6 and a Navy combat dive unit were tasked with reconnaissance and securing key positions before the main assault. Their insertion method, HALO, jump into the Caribbean Sea at night. High altitude, low opening. It's one of the most dangerous infiltration techniques in special operations. Jumpers exit the aircraft at 25,000 feet, free fall through darkness, then open their chutes at the last possible moment to avoid radar detection. Except on this night, everything went wrong. Weather reports were inaccurate. Tropical storms had moved in faster than predicted. As the C-130 approached the drop zone, the pilots encountered heavy cloud cover and high winds. The SEALS jumped anyway. They hit the water scattered across miles of rough ocean. Several parachutes tangled on impact. Weighted down with over 100 pounds of gear, weapons, radios, explosives, at least 4 SEALs went under and never resurfaced. Their bodies were never recovered. The mission was aborted before it began. The survivors were extracted by helicopter, exhausted and shaken. Navy SEALs, the most elite warriors in the American arsenal, had been defeated by the ocean before firing a single shot. The main invasion would proceed anyway, but the omen was clear. This operation was already spinning out of control. October 25th, 5:36 a.m. The sky over Grenada's coast was still dark when the USS Caron, a Spruance-class destroyer, detected radar emissions from Fort Frederick, a coastal defense position overlooking the capital, St. George's. Cuban and Grenadian forces had established anti-aircraft batteries there. If they locked onto incoming Marine helicopters or transport planes, American casualties would skyrocket. The Caron's captain made the call. Fire for effect. The destroyer's 5-inch Mark 45 naval guns swiveled toward the coordinates. Each round weighed 70 pounds and traveled at 2,600 feet per second. The bombardment lasted 8 seconds, 15 rounds, 8 seconds. The coastal battery was obliterated. The gun emplacements, the radar station, the command post, reduced to smoking craters. It was the opening note of a symphony of violence. Moments later, the invasion began in earnest. At Point Salines Airport, 2 battalions of Army Rangers parachuted onto the tarmac at 500 feet, half the standard jump altitude, to avoid anti-aircraft fire. They landed hard, some breaking bones on impact. Immediately, they were met with tracer fire. Cuban construction workers armed with AK-47s and RPGs had fortified positions around the unfinished runway. These weren't civilian contractors. They were Cuban military engineers with combat experience from Angola. They fought with discipline and ferocity. Rangers stormed the terminal building room by room. Grenadian fire from hidden positions. Hand grenades exchanged in stairwells. Close quarters battle at dawn. Simultaneously, Marines landed on the northern beaches at Pearls Airport. Opposition was lighter there, but confusion reigned. Radio frequencies were incompatible between Army and Marine units. Maps were inaccurate. Friendly forces nearly engaged each other multiple times. And still, the American students remained trapped. The mission wasn't conquest. It was rescue. Intelligence had identified St. George's University's main campus at True Blue near Point Salines Airport. But as Rangers secured the perimeter, they discovered something terrifying. Most of the students weren't there. A second campus existed at Grand Anse, 2 miles away behind enemy lines. Over 200 American students were stranded, surrounded by hostile forces, with no protection. The Rangers needed helicopter support for an extraction, but Army helicopters were scattered and engaged elsewhere. They requested Marine air support. The Marine Corps sent UH-60 helicopters escorted by AH-1 Cobra gunships. The insertion at Grand Anse unfolded like a scene from Apocalypse Now. Helicopters roared over the beach at low altitude. Door gunners fired suppressing bursts into the tree line. Cobras unleashed rocket pods at suspected defensive positions. Rangers fast roped onto the campus grounds, immediately engaging Grenadian soldiers who had taken positions in surrounding buildings. Students were hustled out of dormitories, some still in pajamas, clutching passports and family photos. The evacuation took 26 minutes. Every helicopter was hit by ground fire. One Cobra took a direct RPG strike, but managed to limp back to sea. Not a single student was killed. As the last UH-60 lifted off, students looked back at their campus. Bullet-scarred, smoke rising from nearby buildings, a surreal nightmare they would never forget. One student later said, "We thought we were gonna die." Then we heard American voices shouting orders. "I've never felt safer in my life."
But the operation was far from clean. Friendly fire incidents plagued Urgent Fury from the start. On October 26th, a Navy A-7 Corsair jet mistakenly bombed a Grenadian mental hospital, killing 18 civilians. The pilot had been given wrong coordinates. The hospital was never marked on his map. At Point Salines, an American forward air controller called in an airstrike on what he believed was an enemy command post. It was a U.S. Army position. One Ranger was killed, several wounded. Communication breakdowns weren't just inconvenient, they were lethal. The Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force were operating on different radio systems. Commanders couldn't talk to each other in real time. One officer later recalled using a payphone, an actual Caribbean payphone, to call Fort Bragg and request artillery support. Despite the chaos, American forces systematically dismantled resistance. Grenadian People's Revolutionary Army units collapsed within 48 hours. Cuban forces retreated into fortified positions, but eventually surrendered when faced with overwhelming firepower. By October 27th, the fighting was effectively over. General Hudson Austin was captured hiding in a vegetable crate. The runway at Point Salines was secured. The students were evacuated. The Cuban advisors were sent home. Operation Urgent Fury was declared a success, but at what cost? The butcher's bill. 19 American servicemen killed, 116 wounded, 45 Grenadian soldiers dead, 358 wounded, 24 Cuban combatants killed, 59 wounded, and 18 Grenadian civilians, the mental hospital victims. Tactically, it was a victory. Strategically, it was a wake-up call. The Department of Defense launched immediate reviews. The findings were damning. Joint operations were a disaster. The Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force had no effective way to communicate or coordinate in real time. Intelligence was catastrophically inadequate. Commanders went into battle with less information than a tourist would have. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 was a direct result of Grenada's failures. It revolutionized the U.S. military by mandating joint training, unified command structures, and interoperable communications. Every major operation since, from Desert Storm to Afghanistan, owes its organizational structure to lessons learned in Grenada. But there were other consequences. The Reagan administration imposed a total media blackout. Journalists were banned from the island for the first 48 hours. When they finally arrived, the battle was over. This sparked a fierce debate about war reporting and the First Amendment. The Pentagon had learned from Vietnam: control the narrative, control public perception. Internationally, the invasion was controversial. The United Nations General Assembly condemned it as a violation of international law. Even Margaret Thatcher, Reagan's closest ally, privately opposed the operation. But in the United States, it was overwhelmingly popular. Reagan's approval ratings soared. Americans saw their president as decisive, strong, willing to protect U.S. citizens abroad. The students returned home to cheering crowds. Some kissed the tarmac at Charleston Air Force Base. For many, Urgent Fury was the moment America shed the ghost of Vietnam. Proof that the military could execute a mission decisively, even if imperfectly. There's a photograph from the aftermath of Urgent Fury that didn't make the newspapers. It shows an Army Ranger standing on the tarmac at Point Salines, helmet tilted back, rifle slung low, staring at the sunrise over the Caribbean. He looks exhausted, relieved, maybe contemplating how close the mission came to disaster. Operation Urgent Fury wasn't a perfect war. It was messy, chaotic, and at times tragically flawed. SEALs drowned in the dark. Friendly fire killed Americans. Civilians died in a mistaken bombing. Communication failures turned coordination into improvisation. But it also revealed something essential about the American military ethos: adaptability under pressure. When plans collapsed, commanders adjusted. When technology failed, soldiers relied on guts and training. When the mission demanded speed, they delivered, even if imperfectly. The 8 seconds that opened the battle, the destroyer's bombardment at dawn, symbolized something larger than firepower. It was a statement. America would act, decisively, overwhelmingly. Grenada became a case study. West Point teaches it. Marine officers analyze its failures. Joint Special Operations Command reformed because of it. Today, the island is peaceful. The airport the Cubans built, it's now Maurice Bishop International Airport, a hub for tourists seeking Caribbean beaches. The medical school still operates. American students still study there, most unaware that their campus was once a battlefield. But in the Pentagon, in the halls of Fort Bragg, on Navy destroyers patrolling distant seas, the lessons of Urgent Fury endure. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones that go perfectly. They're the ones we learn from. This has been the story of the 8-second showdown that changed everything. Thanks for watching.